Following the Holocaust, the world community, led of course by the United States and Great Britain, sought to create a European Jewish-only state in the heart of the Holy Land. This humanitarian move, though, utterly failed in respecting the humanity of the land's indigenous inhabitants, Christian and Muslim Palestinians. Starting in December of 1947, their land and property was seized and destroyed to make way for the state of Israel, where white-only European Jews would live. Nearly 1 million Palestinians were expelled and over 10,000 were killed by the British and U.S. armed Zionist militias, and later Israeli forces during the Nakba, an acronym word meaning catastrophe. Those expelled by the Nakba and their Palestinian descendants, who make up the world's largest refugee population in the world, are not even allowed to return to their land. Yet a recent poll found that nearly half of Americans believe Palestine occupies Israel, not the other way around. That's because the mainstream corporate-owned media continues to spin a propaganda wheel that dehumanizes Palestinians and paints Israel as a beacon of democracy and racial and religious tolerance. Meanwhile, special interest groups like the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, snake their agenda into media reporting and analysis while buying their way into the hearts and minds of our elected officials. Ever wonder why Israel gets $3 billion in annual military funding from Uncle Sam? We'll connect the dots from the campaign contributions to the spending bill. There's a lot riding on our relationship with Israel. Apart from serving as a proxy for U.S. relations in the Middle East and Africa, Israel is America's second top destination for arms exports next to Saudi Arabia. That's right, a country that's no bigger than the state of New Jersey is basically a black check for the military-industrial complex. But not all Americans are on board with the notion that Israel is the victim of Palestinian oppression. Another study actually showed that 62% of the population now believes Israel gets too much foreign aid. And the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has made waves across the world, imposing a kind of sanction against Israel's economy by targeting Israeli products. Now, a new documentary featuring Noam Chomsky and Roger Waters, called The Occupation of the American Mind, brings attention to how Israel's public relations campaign has successfully manipulated the narrative of the Israel-Palestinian conflict in America, and that it's not a conflict at all, but a matter of modern-day colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid. And today I'm joined by Sut Jhally, director of The Occupation of the American Mind and a professor of communication at the University of Massachusetts. I asked Jhally to explain how Americans are being kept in the dark about Palestine and how that prevents a mass movement against Israeli apartheid from forming in the United States. Check it out.
The major way that Americans misunderstand the situation in Israel-Palestine is that the American media and American culture has presented Israel as the victims in this conflict, as the victims of Palestinian aggression. And everything that Israel has done, from bombing Gaza 3 times to the continued occupation of the West Bank, is framed in this defensive way. That it's Israel that's on defense. And that's the major misunderstanding that Americans have about the situation, is they simply don't know the history of Israeli actions against the Palestinians for the last 50 years.
Right, and obviously empathy can be created through more information and more knowledge. If Americans received more honest news from Palestine, including coverage of Israeli bombardment of Gaza, for example, do you think our attitudes would change here in the United States?
If Americans got a more accurate understanding of it, not even more accurate, but even something that actually was able to articulate the Palestinian side, I think you would see a dramatic shift in public opinion. Part of that, we're already seeing it at the edges. We're already seeing it with young people who are much less connected to mainstream media and get their information from the internet and get their media from information from social media. But for young people who get their information from another place, attitudes are shifting quite dramatically. In fact, Frank Luntz, who is a major pollster that the Israel lobby uses, when he did his latest survey, said that young people were a disaster when it came to support of Israel. And what that's indicative of is when Americans, in fact, are given another side, or when they're given more complete information, their views on the conflict change, because it's actually then informed by fact and not a simple control of the narrative that Israel has been able to do so far. In terms of, I think we're already starting to see it a little bit. We started to see it in the Bernie Sanders campaign. when Sanders, when he was in Brooklyn, actually, said something about treating Palestinians as human beings. That was, in one sense, a very dramatic breakthrough, as were the cheers that came from the crowd when he said that. So we know that when people have alternative views, have different views, have more information, that their views change. This is something, by the way, that Frank Luntz, who is, as I said, who's the pollster who studies this very closely, this is something that he knows. In a report that he did in 2009, when he was advising Israeli spokespeople how to present themselves or how to present the conflict, he actually said that when Americans understand history, when you ask Americans about whether Israel should withdraw to the 67 borders, that support for Israel plummets. And that instead, when you talk about terrorism, then support for Israel goes up. And essentially what he was saying was that you have to keep history out of it. You have to keep, he's like a magician. Magicians work by deflection, they work by making sure you're not seeing in the right place. And that's exactly what the Israel lobby wants Americans to do in terms of this conflict, to understand it only through terror, through terrorism, and framing Hamas and any Palestinian actor and any Palestinian resistance as terrorism, and not see it through what it actually is, which is about territory and the control of land. In fact, in this report that Luntz did, he said that, I think the three most important words he says, the advice he gives is, he says, the way that Israel representatives should frame this is in terms of terror, not territory. Because the more it's framed in terms of territory, the more Americans, in fact, sympathize with the Palestinians.
Right, and you and other media experts like Noam Chomsky have argued that increasing corporate and government control of the media obviously threatens democracy. How does this relate to Israel's spin control in the United States?
The reason Israel's spin control works so well in the United States, and it doesn't work so well in other countries, is because the American media system is already being highly controlled by corporate and government sources. And those corporate and government sources, their policy support for Israel means that any kind of narrative that fits in with that places Israel as the victim is going to be highlighted in that. So in that sense, the Israel-Palestinian conflict is, I think, actually the most spectacular kind of example of how corporate and government control of our narratives, of the narratives of the media spin, works. And Israel would not be able to control the narrative in the way that it's done if it wasn't for the way in which American media are already set up to be controlled by corporate interests and to give priority to government spokespeople who are already highly supportive of Israel.
I want to move on to your documentary. How exactly did the occupation of the American mind come about? Why is there a need for this kind of movie right now?
It came about actually from a while ago. I was teaching class. I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts, and I was teaching my large lecture class on ideology and propaganda. And at the very start of the class, I asked them what they knew about the Middle East, not what they thought, but what they knew about the Middle East. And I gave them a very simple question. I said, who in the Middle East has been continually condemned in the United Nations for illegally occupying someone else's land? That's an objective question, the answer to which is Israel. And over a period of 3 years, I found that between 53% and 63% of my students thought that it was the Palestinians that were illegally occupying someone else's land. And so I was interested, like, how can reality be shifted in this way? Essentially, reality shifts on its head. How does it happen? Well, it can only happen through the control of the sources that people have for making sense of the world. And so I wanted to look at how does this kind of spinning reality on its head come about. And when we start to do that, you realize that the Israeli lobby campaign is a very, very sustained and very, very systematic attempt to keep Americans ignorant of the basic facts of the situation. And the reason we call it the occupation of the American mind is that the occupation of the West Bank and the siege of Gaza are only possible because of American support. And therefore, for that occupation to continue, you also have to occupy American media and especially American public opinion so that the American public will put no pressure on its elected representatives to change this outrageous situation. And so the occupation of the American mind is actually absolutely vital to the continuing military occupation of the West Bank.
Right, and I'm really glad you talked about that because these attacks, or the attack on free speech rights, is expanding to BDS and other Palestinian rights activists. Why do you think we're seeing an increase in this attack against free speech, and how is the media participating in those attacks?
Well, the media is occupied by Israel, and part of that process, or part of that strategy, is to make sure that any kind of opposition is silenced. Public relations and propaganda works in two ways. On the one hand, you have to control the narrative. You have to control the story that's been told, that it's Israel that's on the defensive, it's Israel that's the victims in all this, that it's the Palestinian terrorists who are attacking them. On the one hand, you have to do that, and they've done that extremely well. You just have to, you just have to look at the media to see how well they've done it. But the other part of it is you also have to silence any kind of counter narrative. You also have to make sure that your narrative has a monopoly. And therefore, you have to silence any other voices. And the major way that's done is by equating any kind of critique of the policies of the State of Israel with anti-Semitism, and try and shut people up by accusing them of being racist. To the extent, I think it's actually a wholly positive development. To the extent that BDS is being attacked, and being attacked fairly viciously, by all kinds of people in the mainstream media, it's an indication that they're having an effect. The more that Israel and the Israel lobby and its representatives have to try and focus on BDS, the reason they're doing it is because these other narratives are now starting to make a difference. And so you have to silence them. You have to silence them by essentially saying anyone who has any other kind of view on this is an anti-Semitic bigot.
Well, so tell me a little bit more about where people can find out more about your work and how they can watch The Occupation of the American Mind before I let you go.
Sure. The movie can be seen with distributing it straight away to people via the internet. So if you go to www.occupationmovie.com, that's occupationmovie.com, you can actually stream the film there, and you can also purchase a DVD. So I hope people will do that. What we want people to do is to watch it and to understand the propaganda that you're subjected to. And as soon as you understand the propaganda, it will never work the same way again. Every time you now see the propaganda, you will see the reality behind it. And what we hope is that people will take this film and use it as a resource to try and educate Americans, try and educate their fellow Americans, essentially for anti-occupation resistance in America. And the way that happens is by seeing clearly the propaganda that we are subjected to, and then taking actions once you know what the truth is.
You obviously chose some very influential characters to be in your film. Talk to me about the characters like Noam Chomsky, Roger Waters, and Amir Haas. Why did you choose them, and what role did they play?
Yeah, the people in the film are, some of the major experts in this area. Whether it's, Noam Chomsky, who's been an outspoken critic of Israel for a long time, to people like Youssef Munir, who leads the U.S. campaign to end the occupation, to people like Rashid Khalidi, who's one of the major academics who's written about this. So all we wanted to do was to present the basic, the people who are the most articulate in being able to deconstruct the propaganda campaign. We were also very lucky in that we got Roger Waters, co-founder of Pink Floyd, to narrate it. And what I hope is that if you have someone like Roger Waters connected with this, that it has a chance of getting into places, into sources, into the heads of people who otherwise would never have thought about this. And so again, we are very, very lucky that we got Roger Waters involved in this. And although we know it was a great risk on his part as well, because he has been viciously attacked because of his focus on Palestinian human rights. But we want that the film. We hope the film will come across as a very objective way of looking at the situation. And the people we chose were the ones we thought would give us the greatest chance of getting into other places.
Sut Jhally, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.